Well, good evening and welcome back to Introduction to Composition and Research. This is week 9, and we are looking tonight at research sources and processes related to research. There is no writing assignment this week. The midterm should be returned by today in the course of the class. Now, let's talk about first sources for research. Sources for research. Where do you go to get the information, to find the information that you need for a research paper? The main focus of research for this particular course is twofold, two parts. It has to do with literary research primarily and historical research. Now, last week we talked about some other aspects, research projects and things of that sort, and you may get into some of those if you take, as I said last time, the leadership track or the missions track in the Georgia School of Preaching. Generally speaking, though, in the biblical textual classes and the related classes, your research will be literary and historical. Now, there are other areas that we have not discussed, other areas of research that would include activities like designing and executing surveys. And that would be surveys of people, not surveys of property. Developing or implementing programs. And that might be on a congregational level, or that might be on a school-wide level, or a business-wide level, something of that sort. There is what's called descriptive research. There is case study analysis and something called action research. And those we don't cover in this course because, quite frankly, they're not really germane to this course of study in the school. Our focus in this particular class is on historical research and literary research. And historical research in this context is a subsection or a specialized variety of literary research. Literary, that means you're going to be looking at books, articles, magazines, writings, historical things, yes. Literary research is the study of information sources that have already been written. That's it in a nutshell. Literary research is the study of resources, information sources that have already been written. It concerns itself with examining literature. And in this context, literature includes books and articles and texts and letters and transcripts and digital sources, which might be blogs or online databases, things of that sort. Now, there are two primary categories of literary sources. Two categories of literary sources, I should say. Two categories. Number one is primary sources. Primary sources are original documents. A primary source is an original document, a document for which there is no previous source for that information. There's no backstory to it. A primary source would include books or articles in magazines, journals, newspapers, or digital sources. It might include letters that someone wrote. It might be the text of a speech that a speaker presented. Primary sources are not, they're not reports of what someone said. Primary sources are not reports of what someone else wrote, even if that person was an eyewitness. The Bible would be considered a primary source because there is no previous human source of information on which it is based. Now, having said that, let me qualify that with this observation. Modernist scholars and skeptics will look to ancient sources, ancient books, ancient writings, and try to credit some of them as original sources for some of the things found in the Bible. You look back to the Gilgamesh epic and some of the ancient records of global flooding, and the skeptic will look at those and try to predate those from the Bible and say the Bible, Moses drew on those for the Bible. However, that cannot be proven. It makes as much sense to argue that those sources drew from the Bible as it does to argue that the Bible drew from them. You can't prove that case either direction. So the Bible should be considered a primary source. There's no previous human source on which it can be proven to be based. Now, the writings of someone like Flavius Josephus in the 1st century, a Jewish historian of that era, some of what Josephus wrote could be considered a primary source in those matters in which he is recounting actual events that he lived through, that he experienced. So, when Josephus writes about the wars of the Jews, the historical portions of what he writes are not a primary, he is not a primary source because he is reiterating the history of his people before his life. He's reiterating, he's repeating what he had learned from the scriptures and from traditions handed down and perhaps from other historical sources that were available to him. That's not a primary source. Josephus is not a primary source in those things. However, when it comes to 1st century Jewish history, and Josephus begins to write about the conquest of Judah by the Romans, and the destruction and sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and so forth. When he writes about the conquest of Masada several years later, now Josephus is a primary source. And the reason is because he was there. He saw it, he experienced it, he lived through it, and he is recording what he has firsthand knowledge of. So a primary source is, in effect, the original document on any given subject. The other category is what are typically called secondary sources. And I think that's the distinction between these two is simple and probably pretty obvious. When you know the definition of one, then the definition of the other becomes obvious. A secondary source, in effect, is what someone else wrote about a primary source. Some examples of secondary sources. A Bible commentary is a secondary source. What Martin Luther or John Knox or John Calvin or Charles Wesley, what Martin Lloyd Jones or R.C.H. Lenski or John MacArthur, what Flavel Nichols or Hardeman Nichols, what Guy N. Woods, what Burton Kaufman wrote about the Bible or about a particular passage, those are secondary sources. Their information is worthy of consideration. Another example would be the Quran. The Quran cannot, from a literary standpoint, be considered a primary source because Islam's holy book purports to record what Allah revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, but it was compiled not from and not by Muhammad himself, but from the memories of those who heard Muhammad speak. So it's secondhand. It's not what Muhammad said, it's what they remember that he said. And again, go back to Josephus. The writings of Josephus about Jewish history, about Jesus, about Old Testament teachings, things in which he was not personally present. Those are secondary sources. So you see, a primary source can fall into both categories. Someone who is a primary source, some of what he writes, some of what he records could fall into each category. Historically, or historical sources typically differ from generic literary resources, and historical research differs from literary research only in that its emphasis lies on finding and using as much primary source information as is possible. Where it's possible, we want to go back to the actual source of the information. Sometimes that's not possible. Every Greek lexicon available to us is a secondary source for the simple reason that none of the lexicographers who compiled the definitions and the descriptions of the meanings of first century Greek words, none of them were there. They're all working off of older material to explain the use and the meaning of these words. So, primary versus secondary sources. Sources for research. Now, I said a moment ago in our sources for research that we might be looking at transcripts of speeches, for instance. It's also possible that you might be listening to recordings or watching videos of those speeches or of a class lesson or of something of that sort. That could be considered a primary source because it is a recording of the person actually delivering the speech or teaching the class or presenting the sermon or what have you. And it needs to be documented as thoroughly as any literary source. Now let's talk about principles of writing specifically for publication. Preachers and Bible class teachers, let me put this on the board for emphasis' sake. And I want you to remember this, if only because I firmly believe it. Preachers need to write. Preachers need to write. Writing for publication is not something taught in most colleges, most universities. It's not taught in the Bible departments of most of our schools. It's not taught, to my knowledge, outside of this class in the Georgia School of Preaching curriculum. Preachers need to write. Here's why. Number one, writing, if you're going to write well, sharpens your analytical skills. If you're going to write well, you're going to write, you're going to organize your thoughts, you're going to read what you have written, you're going to rewrite what you have written, you're going to correct and amend and clean up and sharpen what you write until it clearly says what's in your mind. Writing sharpens your analytical skills. Now, the corollary to that is writing will sharpen your reading analytical skills. If you write regularly, consistently, if you just write an article a week for a church bulletin, or even once a month, it will change the way you read when you are reading for information. Now, if you're reading a biography of Winston Churchill, or if you're reading Harry Potter, if you're a fan of John le Carre or Stephen King, I wouldn't understand why you'd be a fan of Stephen King, but if you're reading for enjoyment, that's one thing. But when you read for information, being a writer will sharpen your reading analytical skills. It will make you pay attention and follow the reasoning and the line of thought in what you're reading. Preachers and Bible class teachers who write regularly generally write manuscripts. Now, in the GSOP curriculum, there are 2 semesters of homiletics, or I think the catalog still calls it sermon preparation and delivery. Those 2 semesters, those 2 classes, focus on how to preach. They focus on the oral presentation, techniques of projecting the voice, proper expression, proper breathing, but they also, especially the first semester, very much focuses on how to organize your thoughts on paper, how to outline a sermon, how to make it live so that you can present it in a way that makes it live. Most preachers do not preach from a manuscript. A manuscript is what you have in your textbook, where every word is supplied. I have known preachers who preach from manuscripts, and there are basically 2 kinds of manuscript preachers. One is the guy who's a little bit like Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, great British statesman, Prime Minister of England during World War II, had served in Parliament since before World War I. There was a period during the late 20s and all through the 1930s when he was out of power, but he was never out of Parliament. As a very young man before World War I, the very first time Churchill stood up in the House of Commons to deliver a speech, as soon as he stood up, his mind went blank. He could not remember what he was going to say. And he stood there, frantically trying to remember what he was going to say, until he finally realized that he could not remember, and amid catcalls and mockery, because his father had been a famous member of the House of Commons as well, he sat down humiliated. From that day until the end of his career, he never spoke in public again without a manuscript of what he was going to say. And he would labor over his manuscripts. Now, bear in mind, this is a man who wrote books and books and books and books, volumes about the First and Second World Wars, about politics, about history. But his manuscripts of his speeches, he would labor over his manuscripts of his speeches, changing a word here, moving a comma there. And then when he spoke, he had his manuscript in hand, always, never stapled, always punched and tied with a crimson ribbon. He never used his manuscript. He had it. He never had to look at it. He was a great manuscript speaker. Nowadays, we don't use manuscripts, we have teleprompters. And half the more than half the people that use those don't know how to read a simple English sentence. The other kind of manuscript preacher, a good manuscript preacher, writes out what he's going to say, and like Churchill, he parses it and he works on it and he sweats over it, and then he doesn't need it because he's got it so fixed in his mind he can speak it. And those guys can be great, great preachers. Not because of the manuscript, but because by the time they're done with it, they don't need it. The other kind of manuscript preacher is the guy who takes his manuscript, puts it on the lectern, and begins to read. A book review is meant to describe briefly what a book is about. And before he gets past his introduction, 3/4 of the congregation are asleep or well on their way to La La Land, and the Sandman is busily knocking every remaining one on the head. So, preachers and Bible class teachers who write generally write manuscripts, but not for sermons, not for Bible classes. For sermons, for Bible classes, you outline. If you write a manuscript, then you take it and you condense it to an outline. If you can't condense your basic points of a sermon to 1 page, then you need to reorganize your sermon. Now, I didn't say you need to preach with only 1 page. But preachers, Bible class teachers who write generally write manuscripts, word for word publications. Whether it's contributing a chapter to a lectureship book, for example, whether it's a book for Bible study, and in that case, it might be a book of Bible study outlines, but even there, you need a few complete sentences just to introduce and describe your subject. Whether it's a Bible class lesson that you're going to hand out in class, whether it's a review of someone else's book. Preachers need to write. And there are many, many other circumstances and venues in which a preacher might write. Now, it's not common anymore with the rise of digital media, but in small towns, oftentimes, if there is still a local paper, the church, the elders may ask the preacher to write an article to be submitted to the paper every week. They might buy advertising space for that article. And you want that to reflect well on the church, but you also want it to be readable, interesting, easy to read. Remember Charlie Brown? First grade vocabulary. PhD thoughts and concepts. First grade vocabulary. All this kind of writing, all of these writing tasks should share the same 5 common characteristics. So let's put these on the board. Preachers need to write. And I see that W disappears. Preachers need to write. Number 1, your writing should show solid organization. In other words, what you write ought to make sense. It ought to be logical in the way it advances, regardless of the type of writing that we're talking about, whether it's a single Bible class lesson or a chapter in a lectureship book or a Bible class study book, a manuscript for an entire book, whether it's just a simple review of someone else's book or a critique of something that someone else wrote. Regardless of what it is, what you write should be organized so that the reader can easily follow your thoughts in a logical path from the introduction of the subject to the conclusion of the matter. they ought to be able to see from the beginning to the end the same train of thought. Solid organization. Number two, sources that are arranged in order. And that aspect of your writing is going to be affected by the documentation style that you use. Here's where we start to get down to the differences between Turabian, or the Chicago Manual of Style, and the Modern Language Association, and the American Psychiatric Association, and the Society of Biblical Literature, and all of these different formats or standards of documentation. Turabian and the Society of Biblical Literature both include footnotes and endnotes, as well as a bibliography of the sources that are used. Footnotes are documented, footnotes and endnotes are documented in the order in which the information appears in the writing. So if you have a footnote on page 3 and a footnote on page 4, then the information, the documentation for page 3 footnote goes on page 3. The information for page 4's footnote goes on page 4. If you're using endnotes, which the SBL tends to, then the information goes not on those pages, but it goes on the endnotes page or pages at the end of the chapter or the end of the paper or the end of the book, but it goes in the order in which those references appear. Number 3, followed by number 4, followed by number 5, and so forth. Information in the bibliography for a Turabian format or an SBL format paper is going to be listed in alphabetical order by the first author's or editor's last name. So if you have a book like the Greek lexicon by Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, and Danker, BDAG, then to put that into the bibliography, that's going to be listed by Bauer's last name. Not because B comes before D and G, but because Bauer comes before Arndt in the order of the authors or contributors to the book. So the first author's or first editor's last name. Now, if the book has only one author or one editor, that simplifies things rather dramatically, doesn't it? But sometimes you'll have a book or a source that may have 2, 3, 5, 7, 10 contributors, all listed. It's listed, it's referenced in the bibliography by the last name of the first one. On the other hand, the Modern Language Association and the American Psychiatric Association, MLA and APA styles, generally avoid footnotes altogether. You will not typically find footnotes at all in an MLA or an APA style paper. They prefer in-text references. That means that when you quote from what Guyan Woods said in Questions and Answers, Volume 1, published by the Gospel Advocate Company in 19 whatever it was, right there in the text of what you're writing, after the quote, in parentheses, you would put Woods, no first name, just Woods, comma, page number. And then in your works cited page at the end of the paper, you would list all the information about that particular book. Guyan Woods, Questions and Answers, Gospel Advocate Company, Nashville, Tennessee, 19 whatever, page so-and-so, except you wouldn't put the pages there. The pages are in the text. The reader then has to, when he comes to that reference, has to go back to the works cited to figure out what book you're talking about. Those sources in the works cited page are also referenced by the first author's or first editor's last name first. So, arrange your sources in order. This gets to how you format properly. Organize what you're writing, arrange your sources in the proper order for the formatting style you're using. Number 3, avoid excessive quotations. And the key word here is excessive. In my library, I have probably several hundred by now lectureship books. Books on topics, books on themes, and books on the text of the Bible that are cooperative efforts produced by gospel preachers and sometimes by schools of preaching or by universities. The most recent one is the recently held Freed Hardeman University lectures last month in February. And it has always frustrated me a little bit for a textual lectureship book. You flip over to the particular chapter of the particular biblical book that you're studying in that lectureship book. Let's say on the book of Mark, for example, and you're studying Mark chapter 7, and you want to read about, let's see, in Mark chapter 7, if I remember correctly, we're going to bump into the Gadarene, no, I think it's chapter 8, the Gadarene demoniac. And so you turn to that section of the commentary, the lectureship book. No, it's before that. It's in chapter 6. And what's the first thing you find there? The entire text of Mark chapter 6. Some editors, producers of some lectureships chose to include the text, the entire text of each chapter in the chapter. That's a stylistic choice, a publisher's choice, if you will. That's their privilege. Usually it's because they have a preference for the version of the Bible being used. But when that's not the case, and I turn over to Mark chapter 6 in the XYZ lectureship book on Mark, and there the first 3 pages or the first 2 pages of the manuscript are the text of Mark chapter 6, not with words explained or comments, just the text. That's not necessary because I have a Bible. And I can open my Bible and read the text. I didn't buy the book so you could repeat the text of what I already have. I bought the book for the information that you could provide me about that text and about the application and the lessons and so on and so forth. Yes, I'm a little bit on my soapbox here. I'll get off in a minute. Avoid excessive quotations. And I'm not necessarily talking about biblical quotations here. There are few things more useless than a commentary on the Bible that quotes another commentary on the Bible. If you, and here I will give backhanded praise in a manner of speaking. Brother Burton Kaufman, among preachers and scholars in churches of Christ, accomplished a monumental feat in producing himself commentaries on every single book of the Bible, Old and New Testaments. It was the work of probably 40 years of his later life. In his 80s, he was still publishing books on the Old Testament. And he finished those commentaries, and they are, on balance, they are excellent commentaries, very good practical commentaries. They're now published by Abilene Christian University Press. They were originally, the New Testament was originally published by the Firm Foundation when it was still in business. One of the things you bump into in Kaufman's commentaries, though, from time to time, is that Kaufman will tell you what J.R. Dumelow says about this particular passage, or Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, what they say. And he doesn't say that, he doesn't give you that information to contrast it necessarily, or to say this is not correct or this is the correct. He just says, well, here's what they say. I happen to have J.R. Dumelow's commentary on the scriptures. I happen to have Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown's commentary on the scriptures. With all due respect, Brother Kaufman, I bought this book so you could tell me what you learned, not what Dumelow says. Avoid excessive quotations. The key word is the word excessive. Quotations should be used to document or to illustrate a point, not simply to occupy space in writing. And this is where the average college student loves quotations, because they take up space, they bulk up your word count, they increase your page count, they make you look smart, because your 10-page research paper is now 15 pages because of all these quotes. And your professor will look at your paper and mark you off for all those quotes, unless your professor's an idiot. And there are plenty of those. Number 4, that's free. I'll get off my soapbox now. Number 4, follow through. Follow through. In other words, document the purpose of what you are writing in the introduction. When you write a research paper and you tell your teacher that this is what the research paper is going to be about, follow through and make it about that. Don't get diverted off onto some tangent. Don't use the paper. And here is one of the outstanding mistakes that GSOP students typically make in writing research papers. Mark this down. Your research paper is not a sermon. You do not need to convert your teacher. Your teacher is already a brother in Christ. And the purpose of your research paper is not to persuade him. It is to show what you learned. That means that you don't need hyperbolic statements followed by 3 exclamation points or 3 question marks or what have you. You're not trying to persuade me or any other teacher. You're trying to demonstrate this is what I learned. So, follow through. Document the purpose of what you're writing in the introduction. Present the fruit of your research in the body of the paper. Summarize what that research reveals. And don't meander. Don't wander like the Chattahoochee in presenting either the information that you've gleaned out of your sources or in showing how it relates to your purpose in writing. Offer a clearly stated summary and a conclusion, even, maybe especially, if your research turns out to be inconclusive. Maybe you go into your research project or your research study expecting that the biblical text or the historical documents or what have you are going to bring you to this conclusion. This is your hypothesis presented in your introduction. I presuppose, I hypothesize, this is where this will go and this is what the result will be. And you get to the end, you've shown all the information that you've gathered, you've assimilated it, you've digested it, you've explained it, and your conclusion is, boy, this didn't go at all where I thought it was going to go, and it didn't lead me where I thought I'd end up. Offer a clearly stated summary and a clearly stated conclusion. If the research turns out to be inconclusive, or it goes somewhere that you didn't expect it to go, or it flies in the face of conventional wisdom, make that point clearly and don't apologize for it. Follow through. Number 5 actually is that last point. Sort of combine those without meaning to. A clearly stated summary and conclusion. If you'll do these 5 things in your writing, these things will sharpen your analytical ability in your own thinking, in your own writing. They will sharpen your ability to express yourself clearly, understandably, and unequivocally without hemming and hawing around. And they will also sharpen your ability to analyze what others write. And as a preacher, a teacher of the Word of God, James gives us a warning and says, "Be not many of you teachers, brethren, knowing we shall receive the heavier judgment." He doesn't say don't teach. He says, count the cost. Recognize that you are opening yourself to greater responsibility in teaching. In analyzing. Sometimes your analysis necessitates picking flaws. We went into the school library and then into the church library a couple of weeks ago. And at the risk of making you motion sick, I showed you just shelves and shelves and shelves of commentaries and books and sources and what have you. And probably 90%, maybe more, of those books were not produced by New Testament Christians. They're the fruit and the labor of sincere, well-intentioned denominational writers. They're useful resources. A denominational believer whose scholarship is stronger than his denominational commitments is a great, great asset in your biblical studies, because he will tell you the truth of what this word or this phrase or this sentence or this verse in the scripture means in its context, rather than, or at least before he tells you, what his particular denominational view of it is. If you have or have access to Albert Barnes' massive commentary on the Old and New Testaments. Now, some of the Old Testament volumes are actually by F.C. Bauer and by several other sources, not actually by Barnes. Barnes didn't finish the whole Bible. But if you have Barnes' commentary, it's a standard Old Testament or Old and New Testament commentary series. It was produced by a man who was a Presbyterian. Now, it's an older reference. It dates from the 1800s, if memory serves me, late 17, early 1800s. Albert Barnes was a good scholar, a good student, good writer. And one of the virtues of many of Barnes' comments on the scriptures are that one of the virtues is that he will tell you, here's what this verse means. Here's what these words mean. Here's the implication of them in their context. Here's the historical background of it. Here is what it says, what it means. And when it says something that contradicts typical Protestant or Presbyterian theology, Barnes has the honesty to basically say, this is what it means, but here's what we believe. He's honest in that respect. It's very helpful. R.C.H. Lenski, the great Lutheran scholar and commentator of the mid-20th century, is much the same way. On the other hand, there are those writers who deliberately try to conceal their theology and pass it off as scholarship. Now, the most glaring examples of this in recent memory are not in biblical study books, not in commentaries at all, but in fictionalized teaching books. And the two most effective proponents, or practitioners, I should say, of this would be the writing team of Jerry Jenkins and Tim LaHaye and John Hagee in San Antonio. Now, these guys are not in cahoots with each other so far as I know, but they represent the same basic biblical interpretive school. That is, they're dispensational theologists. They are looking for a physical, material return of Jesus to the earth to conquer all of the enemies of the Lord's people and to massively convert all Jews and to reign for 1,000 years from an earthly throne in Jerusalem over the whole earth. Hagee inserts his theology into books that are related, shall we say, to biblical subjects. He'll take a biblical image or a biblical passage and build a whole book around it. 4 Blood Moons was the last one that I was aware of, in which he was trying to apply passages from both Old and New Testaments that have to do with prophecies of things to come, prophecies of judgment and so forth for ancient Israel, for ancient Judah, and in the first century, trying to apply those things to the 21st century church when they've long since been fulfilled. Jenkins and LaHaye are much more subtle than that. Remember the Left Behind series of books? 10 or 12 books that were made into movies and TV shows? Those present dispensational theology in a fictional format. It's a subterfuge, a way of trying to insert their perspective on the Bible into the common consciousness. They're still at it. If you watch the Chosen series, my wife is a fan, the first 3 seasons have been pretty good, pretty accurate biblically, but we haven't gotten up to the betrayal, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the things that Jesus says after the resurrection. It'll be interesting to see where they go with that. But mark it down. They will present their theology in those things. Now, 5 steps. Solid organization. Arrange your sources in order according to whatever documentation format you're using. Avoid excessive quotation. Follow through on your introduction and clearly state your summary and your conclusion, even if it's not the conclusion you expected. Now, let me illustrate this just briefly with a book review. And no, I'm not going to give you a book review, a review of an actual book, but rather we'll walk through what we're talking about here. What is a book review? A book review is not a book report. We quit doing book reports in about the 5th grade, didn't we? Unless you have the misfortune to work in corporate America and work for a manager who says, read this book and write me a 6-page report on it by Friday. And if that's your environment, I'm so sorry that you work in a high pressure sales environment. Maybe you want to look for something a little more fulfilling. A book review, unlike a book report, is meant to describe in a brief way what a book is about. What's in it? It presents the main points of the book. It describes the direction in which those points will lead the reader, and it will summarize in just a few sentences what's the main point of the book. What purpose does it serve? What was it about? It will evaluate the content of the book and answer a basic question. Does the writer prove his case? Now we're talking about an academic book or a book that we're not talking about fiction in this particular case. Does the writer prove his case? And it will assess the importance of what the writer wrote. How or does this book make an impact in our lives? Does it affect our society? Does it affect the world? Or is it just a waste of paper? There are some books in that category. A book review might also take note of an author's previous writings if they touch on subjects or themes that are related to the book being reviewed. Now, to use a fictional example, someone who is reviewing The Deathly Hallows by J.K. Rowling, whether it's volume 1 or volume 2, might go back and briefly touch on Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and the books in between the beginning of the series and the end. And he might do that in order to show how the characters were developed and the common themes and so forth in each of Rowling's books. But that's not necessary to every book review. Writings of a religious character would properly be measured against the Bible, against the primary source of information, in order to point out areas where that book agrees with the Bible or disagrees with the Bible. But do not, here's a caution for you, do not attribute ideas or views or consequences to an author. Don't assume, in other words, that this is what this author believes. Use the author's own words to document his views or her views. Now, one other thing, and this gets back to what I said a little while ago about research papers not being sermons, and don't try to convert your teacher because your teacher's already a brother in Christ. When it comes to writing, we need to talk for just a moment about style. Writing a research paper means writing in calm language. I have a dear friend, gospel preacher of no mean ability, and a powerful writer when he wants to be. And this brother writes in nonstop hyperbole. Almost every sentence in any article he writes is hyperbolic. And he does it all the time. Hyperbole to illustrate the point. If a statement feels to you, if something you're writing in a research paper feels like it needs those 3 exclamation points and a bunch of underlining, you probably ought to go back and reword it, because you're not trying to persuade your teacher. You're trying to demonstrate what you learned. Don't express your disgust or your disdain or your contempt for opposing ideas or evidence that contradicts where you think something should go. Let the reader, in this case your teacher, evaluate those things on their own merits. A research paper is meant to show what you learned. Now, it's time for us to take a break, so we'll take 15 minutes and then we'll come back and talk about thought processes for research. All right, let's talk about thought processes for research. And there are some ground rules, you might say, for doing good research. So I'm going to take just a moment and erase this so that we can put these on the board. The first of these ground rules is something that would get pushback in more than a few colleges and universities in the 21st century. But the fact that people push back against it doesn't mean it's not true. Ground rules for the thought processes in research. And rule number 1 is that truth is both knowable and discoverable. Truth is knowable and discoverable. Now, research is a process of curiosity, according to Weimeister, one of the writers that is referenced in our material here. All research takes place with certain presuppositions or certain basic assumptions in the mind of the researcher, whether they're aware of it or not. So it's better to be aware of those presuppositions, those assumptions. And in the case of biblical or Bible-related research, we're going to focus on these 3. Number 1, truth is knowable and discoverable. In the academic world, there are a lot of people today who would debate, who would argue that that statement is not true. They would debate that truth is knowable, or if they accept that truth is knowable, they would debate whether or not it's discoverable, whether or not you can actually find it. But truth is knowable and it is findable. Otherwise, research is meaningless. The irony is that the same professors who will tell you you cannot know truth will assign you a research paper to find it. Number two, research as a process is not always easy. But a result is possible. Research is not always easy. Depending on the subject that you're trying to research, you may have to really dig and scratch and look and even travel to try to find sources. Many years ago, I was asked to write a manuscript for a book, for a chapter in a book, and the topic necessitated some research into various denominational sources to which I did not have ready access. And the local library where I lived had no sources available. No public library within reasonable distance had sources available on that particular subject. I finally wound up having to drive an hour away to a Presbyterian seminary and obtain a library card to be able to use their theological library in order to have access to the sources I needed for that particular research. Now, driving an hour might not seem terribly inconvenient nowadays, but then it was considerable. Research is not easy, and having to figure out how to find the periodicals I needed and so forth was not easy in that library. But number three, good research. We'll put that word in quotes, good, and then we'll qualify it. Accurate research. Requires objectivity. Objectivity, the ability to be fair, the ability to not have a dog in the fight as you're going through and finding information. It requires focus. That is, the ability to concentrate on the particular subject. It requires clearly expressed groundwork. And that is half the battle in your research. Clearly expressed groundwork. That is, as you are presenting the fruit of your research, you're expressing it, you're describing it, you're referencing it in a logical, orderly fashion, in a way that shows how it relates to what you're doing. That gets to logical organization. And the last thing good research, good thinking for research requires humility. If I already know the outcome of my research before I begin, then there's no need to conduct research. And my efforts in that case are not really research. Think of it this way. If I decide that the easiest way to prepare a research paper for this class is to log on to ChatGPT and give it these parameters on this subject and let it produce in MLA format or APA format or Turabian a research paper for me to hand in, then there's no point to the assignment, is there? Objectivity is the ability and the willingness to fairly, to honestly consider all of the evidence and all of the information that becomes available during the course of research. Objectivity, willing to consider everything fairly, impartially. It takes into account the impact of negative information, negative evidences, things that would tend to refute or contradict or disprove what I think is going to be the outcome when I start this research. Objectivity openly acknowledges its presuppositions, the givens or the basic assumptions that the researcher brings to the process. Objectivity requires us to evaluate honestly any kind of new information or foreign ideas or information that's discovered in this process. Now, focus. Truth is knowable and discoverable. Research is not easy, but a result is possible. Good research requires focus. Focus simply answers the questions. What is the purpose of this research? What problem, what question does this research seek to answer? Stay focused. Now, presuppositions fall into three main categories. Presuppositions can be your own presuppositions, the researchers, your basic assumptions. Well, we're going to bring some presuppositions to our research for this class. Presupposition number one, we can know and we can find truth. Presupposition number two, it's not necessarily easy, but it is doable. Or maybe we'll leave this out and say our second presupposition is that we have all of the divine truth that's necessary for salvation. We can know it, we can find it, we have it. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3, God hath granted unto us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who has called us, that is Jesus Christ. So our presuppositions need to be acknowledged. Number two, if we know them or if we can discover them, the presuppositions of our sources should be acknowledged. For instance, a Calvinistic writer might reasonably be expected to subscribe to the doctrines of original sin and total human depravity. A charismatic or a Pentecostal source might reasonably expected to believe in continuous, miraculous, personal revelations from God in the 21st century. A Catholic source could reasonably be expected to assert that the weight of papal authority and church tradition is equal to or maybe surpasses the authority of the scriptures. So where we know the presuppositions of our sources, it's helpful sometimes to acknowledge those. That doesn't mean that you need to go into a long, detailed statement that this source is Calvinistic or Catholic or what have you, and therefore, but as it touches what you're studying, what you're researching. But number three, we've got our own presuppositions. We've got the presuppositions of our sources. And then number three would be presuppositions of or about those who read what you write, the results of your research. And in this case, you might reasonably suppose that writing a research paper for an instructor in the Georgia School of Preaching would be writing for someone who has at least a passing familiarity with Greek and Hebrew words. You would be writing for someone who believes that Jesus and the apostles are historical figures who actually really did live in this world, that they are who they say they are. You might reasonably assume that the named Bible writers are the actual writers of the Bible and not pseudonyms for someone else. Now, having said all of that, the point of revealing the presuppositions, the basic assumptions that underlie your research is to let the reader know where you are, where you're coming from. You're the researcher, you're the writer. So you're letting that person know this is my perspective, this is where I come from. And the ultimate purpose of research is to ask in order to answer hard questions about the sources of your information, what it means, what information, what content is there, the qualifications and the intentions of those who wrote it. Now, in that respect, take, for example, Josephus as a writer, both primary and secondary source. As a secondary source, what kind of source is Josephus? Josephus is very much a product of his time. His understanding of Hebrew history, of Jewish history, is through the lens of post-exilic Judaism, post-Babylonian exile Judaism. Now, he's 500 years removed from Babylonian exile, but his understanding of Israel's history is shaped by those experiences. His perspective is very different than a pre-exile Jew, because before Babylonian exile, practically every Jew in the world lived within about 125 miles of each other in the promised land. If they weren't traders out in the world trading, they lived together. After Babylonian captivity, after the restoration under Cyrus, most Jews, arguably probably 95% of all Jews in the world, never lived in Palestine, in the middle, in Judea again. They might have traveled and made a pilgrimage there. Most of them lived in the Gentile world. And over those 5 centuries between Babylon and Josephus, they were scattered from the western side of India all the way to Spain, and from middle Africa as far north as Great Britain and Scandinavian countries. So Josephus's concept of Jewish history, his concept of the Jewish world, would be dramatically different than Jeremiah's, for example, because Jeremiah lived his entire life basically within the confines of Judah, at least until after the destruction of Jerusalem, when he was seemingly taken against his will into Egypt by unfaithful Jews, where he probably died. So, qualifications, the intentions of those who wrote. Josephus wrote with an agenda. When Josephus writes as a primary source about the things that occurred in his own lifetime, it's helpful to know that Josephus first was a Jewish general fighting the Romans before he then became, from the Jewish point of view, a Jewish traitor aiding the Romans. So Josephus is not an impartial observer of first century events. It helps to know that when we read what he wrote. We also want to look at the credibility of the publication. Just because something is printed does not mean it is credible. If you remember the old commercial, and it's an example of a commercial, the illustration succeeding better than the product that it advertised. If you remember the old commercial that mocks the idea that just because something is on the internet, it must be true. And the girl says, well, my boyfriend is a male model, a French male model. And this loser character walks up and says, bonjour. I don't remember the product, but I remember the illustration. The illustration succeeded better than the advertisement. Just because it's been printed doesn't mean it's credible or authoritative. Which one of us is going to accept as gospel, as absolutely true, something that is printed in Pravda, for example, which is the official Russian paper in Moscow, the mouthpiece of the Russian Communist Party? They have an agenda. Now, let's move on from these things to the feasibility of research. And this is something that we really, as students, you really need to understand and consider as you try to select topics for research. That's the feasibility of your research. Now, let me give you a little bit of an illustration of what I'm talking about. My late roommate in Bible school many, many years ago had a classmate who, in his study, decided that he, and this young man was about 18 at the time, decided that he would write a book about communism. And he was going to entitle it Communism, a System of Blasphemy. Now, this callow youth knew effectively nothing about communism, except that it was not the kind of government that we have here in the United States, and therefore it must be a bad thing. And because he knew that communist governments are typically atheistic, well, then it must be a blasphemous thing. And as he set out to write this magnum opus about communism, a system of blasphemy, after a few hours of trying to read and grasp, it dawned on him that his chosen field for this brilliant book was about 10 times this wide. And it would take him most of a lifetime just to digest the information. Feasibility is a matter of practicality. Feasibility of research. How practical is your research topic? Some research efforts, some research topics are simply not practical for some potential researchers. Maybe the researcher simply lacks the academic background to cope, to deal with the material that needs to be studied. Someone who has no knowledge whatsoever of New Testament Greek, for example, will be severely handicapped in the effort to determine contextually the meaning and the use of the word doulos in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8, 9, and 10. Now, in that particular context, doulos is the Greek word for servant. But without some at least passing familiarity with Greek, or at least Greek resources, that person really doesn't have any wherewithal to study that subject in any great degree of depth. They can read what others have written about those passages, but they can't study the actual language and the use of the word itself. Feasibility is about practicality. So, ask and answer questions like these. Number one, are the necessary resources available? Sometimes the resources you need are simply not available to you because of geography, where you live. For some things, if you don't have access to a fairly comprehensively stocked theological library, there are some subjects that you really cannot do justice to because you don't have the resources at your disposal. Question number two, and this kind of gets back to our example of my young friend, my classmates, my roommate's classmate. Am I qualified to do this research? About 1967, the man who became my Spanish professor in college, I have a minor in Spanish. About 1967, he came from Puerto Rico to the University of Alabama to study theater arts, drama. He came to the University of Alabama utterly unable to speak a word of English. He spoke only Spanish. He enrolled as a freshman and managed to graduate. He went on and got a master's degree. But even after several years of college education in the United States, when it came time to do his master's thesis, he had to go to his professor and say, I can do this work, but I can only do it in Spanish. I don't have the vocabulary. I don't understand the English language well enough to do this at this level in English. To the credit of his professors at the University of Alabama, they allowed him to do his master's thesis in Spanish. And he got his master's degree. Am I qualified to do this research? Well, he had to confront the fact, no, I'm not qualified to do this particular research and produce it in English. I may have to cope with the fact that there's some things I'm not qualified to research. My brother-in-law, one of my brothers-in-law, is the senior engineer for Trane Heating and Air Conditioning. Brilliant man. A mathematical whiz. I took algebra, geometry, trigonometry. I took economics, which is applied calculus, which is something that's meant to torture students. I passed every math class I ever took. God willing, I'll never take another math class again. It's not my strong suit. And I would not want to try to produce graduate level work in any field of mathematics. I can make change for $1, which a lot of people can't do, and I can count back change. But higher mathematics are not something that comes easily for me. Would I be qualified to research rocket science or something of that sort that requires a familiarity with higher mathematics? No, I am not qualified. Question number 3, and this is a hard one sometimes for students. Do I have enough time to research this subject or this question? Time is not fungible. You have 168 hours in the week, every week. And if you have a family, they demand time. If you have a job, it demands time. You have to sleep sometime. Do I have enough time to adequately research this subject, this question, and digest and compile and present the results of my research? If I don't, I need to change topics. Number 4, will this research require a greater financial investment than I can bear? Will this cost more than I can afford? Now, that question comes into play more in a collegiate setting and more in an upper level collegiate setting than it is likely to in the Georgia School of Preaching. The significant costs you may incur as a student in the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies might amount to a few $100s over the course of 2, 3, 4 years of taking classes in purchasing books, commentaries, textbooks, reference works, things of that sort, or digital resources, a copy of Logos or Accordance, something like that. Will this require a financial investment that I simply cannot afford? If the answer is yes, then I may need to change the focus of my research. These questions are meant to lead the researcher, that's you, the student, to the reality of limitations. Very often it's necessary to fence in a research topic, to narrow its scope to a manageable size. Delimiting a study topic doesn't mean it's unlimited. It means we're setting the limits of it, limiting the field of study in order to exclude things that would otherwise make it unmanageable. And those might be things like the time that is necessary to complete the research. Do I have enough time to research this? Well, in the course of a semester, there are many topics that you might want to research that you just don't have enough time. There's too much information for you to digest in a semester's time. So you need to narrow down the topic. Research that's conducted on a deadline, research that's conducted on a deadline is necessarily going to exclude sources that you can't get your hands on, that you cannot obtain before that deadline. Now, maybe there are resources available to you in a theological library in Ottawa, Canada, that you can borrow through interlibrary loan. And that's wonderful that they're available, but they're on loan somewhere else right now. And you have to wait until they come back to the library in Ottawa and then submit your request through the local library and then wait on the postal service or however they're delivered. And by the time you get the sources, the deadline for the research paper has passed. Or if it hasn't passed, it's so near that you don't have time to read these 3 600-page volumes and digest everything in them. So research that's conducted on a deadline necessarily has to exclude sources that you can't obtain before that deadline or that you can't digest, that you can't use. It's going to affect things like sources that are not available in English. The vast majority of theological resources produced in the past 500 years have been produced in English. English is and has been for well over a century the most widely spoken language in the world. But there are literally billions of people who do not speak English, do not read English, do not write English, and we're not just talking about Indians and Chinese. Before 1900, for 250 to 300 years, the majority of religious writing in Christendom was done either in German or in Latin. Latin being the language of the Catholic denomination and German being the language of the Lutheran denomination. There are sources that are available from those eras, good sources that are not available in English. They've never been translated. Now, one of the greatest Greek language resources available now is something called Kittle's Theological Dictionary of New Testament Words. It's 10 great big volumes. Kittle was originally written in German, and the work took decades to translate into English, but it is now available, has been for about the past 65, 70 years, available in English. Prior to that, if you wanted to read Kittle, you had to learn German. Monumental work, but sources that are not available in your native language are potentially, they have great importance, but they're not usable by you if you can't readily read and understand that language. Time available, sources in a language that you can understand. Number 3, topics that are too broad for you to comprehensively address in a single research effort. In other words, there are simply too many aspects to a subject to adequately and investigate all of them in one effort. The work of the Holy Spirit. What does the Holy Spirit do? Well, where do you want to start? Old Testament, New Testament. That's a little too broad. That's a lot too broad to address in one research paper. How about worship? Well, that's a great subject. Christians need to know a lot about worship. We need to know how to worship. We need to know how not to worship. We need to understand what worship is and what worship is not. But how are you going to narrow that down? Are you going to focus on worship in spirit or worship in truth? Are you going to talk about worship in ancient times or worship in the church now? All of these things are practical considerations for research and writing research papers. Now, in the remaining time, take your textbook. And we're going to jump ahead to the appendix, page 252 in the 6th edition, on punctuation. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about punctuation. I would suggest that after class, log on to YouTube, look up Victor Borge, B-O-R-G-E, Victor Borge, verbal punctuation. Victor Borge, verbal punctuation, and just watch, listen, be amazed and amused. Punctuation is not just about following rules. There are rules of punctuation, but it's not just about following rules. In reading, you have to recognize, you have to distinguish, as William says, between two different kinds of punctuated sentences. Now, what is punctuation? Punctuation is a visual way for you to hear inflection and tone and pacing and pauses as you read. Williams illustrates this with this very paragraph on page 252. We have to distinguish two kinds of punctuated sentences because readers do. The one you are reading, for example, is one long sentence you will read in a moment. I have chosen to punctuate as one sentence what I might have punctuated as a series of shorter ones. These semicolons, or those semicolons, and the comma before but could have been periods, for example, and that dash could have been a period too. That's one long sentence, properly punctuated. And when you read the punctuation, even though it's long and somewhat complex, it's relatively clear. Without changing the grammar to any appreciable degree, he then changes the punctuation, and the same sentence now becomes, rather than one long sentence, a paragraph, several sentences. We have to distinguish two kinds of punctuated sentences because readers do, period. The one you are reading, for example, is one short punctuated sentence, but it does not feel as long as another sentence you will read in a moment. I have chosen to punctuate as separate sentences what I earlier punctuated as one long one. The period before but, for example, could have been a comma. And the last two periods could have been semicolons. And that period could have been a dash. Shorter sentences. Is the second any clearer than the first? Not really. And that's the point. Punctuation is not so much about hard and fast rules. There are hard and fast rules about punctuation. Punctuation is about clarity. Punctuation is about allowing you to hear in your mind what the writer is saying. Here's the difference between those two, the long sentence and the paragraph made out of the long sentence. That long sentence does not force you to hold a whole series of grammatical relationships in your mind. It presents the information in small bites, and you can digest them as you go. The second one forces you to hold on to the grammar of it and sort it out all along the way, even though it's broken up. Think of it this way. Now, Williams writes, instead of continuing with a series of independent grammatical sentences that we can process individually, it continues with a series of subordinate clauses that we have to keep integrating into a whole. And he expresses it, he illustrates it this way: a sentence that I cannot break into shorter punctuated sentences merely by replacing a comma and semicolons with periods, because it is a sentence consisting of several subordinate clauses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You have a jigsaw puzzle sentence when you string all of these things together without punctuating them clearly. You have to distinguish between two different kinds of punctuated sentences, because that's what you're asking your reader to do. Which means that a long sentence is not necessarily a bad sentence if it is well punctuated. Let me say that again. A long sentence is not necessarily a bad sentence if it's well punctuated, if you use punctuation to make it clear. Now, that also depends on how you construct the sentence. It's not just whether you use commas or semicolons or dashes or what have you. It also depends on you constructing the sentence clearly and logically. But just because it's long doesn't mean it's bad. Flip the page, you look at page 254, and we talk about the style of simple, compound, and complex sentences. A simple sentence. A simple sentence, a single independent clause. It's direct. English dictionaries date back more than 400 years. Simple sentence. Subject, verb, related information. A compound sentence takes two independent clauses and puts them together. English dictionaries date back more than 400 years, comma, there's the one sentence, but conjunction, comma, plus conjunction, the greatest of them all is the Oxford English Dictionary. Okay. The greatest of all English dictionaries is the Oxford English Dictionary. There's one sentence. English dictionaries date back more than 400 years. There's the other sentence. Put them together. How did we join them? With a comma and a conjunction that makes them flow together into two contiguous but related thoughts. Now, take an independent clause and a subordinate or dependent clause. In other words, take a sentence that can stand by itself and take a sentence fragment that cannot stand by itself, put them together, and now you have not a simple sentence, not a compound sentence, but a complex sentence. While there are many good dictionaries, there's your subordinate clause, there's your dependent clause. That's not a sentence by itself. While there are many good dictionaries. What? While there are many good dictionaries, what? You see, that introduces a thought, but it doesn't complete the thought. The independent clause, the complete sentence, is what completes the thought. While there are many good dictionaries, comma, the greatest of them all is the Oxford English Dictionary. The greatest of them all. Well, if you make that its own sentence, the greatest dictionary of all is the Oxford English Dictionary. Simple sentences are good because they're simple. Not everything needs to be simple. Something that feels simple when you read it isn't necessarily simple. And Williams gives us a couple of illustrations of this. A grammatically simple sentence that's really not all that pleasing to the ear. Our review of the test resulted in a decision as to its suspension as a result of complaints from teachers. Well, that's simple because it's one somewhat convoluted independent clause. Make it more grammatically complex, and you actually make it easier to read. When we reviewed the test, comma, we decided to suspend it because teachers complained about it. They both said the same thing, but grammatically, the more complex sentence, you have a dependent clause and an independent clause. You have a sentence fragment and a complete sentence joined together with a comma. That's actually much easier to read, much clearer, much more direct than the grammatically simple sentence was. I like the way that Williams gets to the heart of this by describing it as thoughtful punctuation. Now, he gives several things here, and I'm not going to read through this word for word. I would encourage you to read this chapter. It's not hard reading. If you're not a grammar Nazi by nature, you're not a grammarian, you may have to reread bits of it a time or two. But Williams is a very good writer, and what he says makes sense. A grammatical sentence is a single independent clause, a simple sentence, basically, plus all of its related or subordinate clauses, if there are any. It doesn't have to have them, but that's a grammatical sentence. A compound sentence is the joining of at least two grammatical sentences, two simple sentences. I left, there's one sentence, but I returned. I returned, there's another sentence. Put them together, now you've got one sentence. I left, but I returned. Don't even need a comma. You just put a conjunction, but, in there, a coordinative conjunction. It coordinates the relationship between those two sentences. A punctuated sentence may consist of one grammatical sentence or several joined with punctuation. You have to let readers know where one sentence stops and another sentence starts. That's what a period does. Grade school teachers nowadays teach their students that a period is a full stop. When they're teaching reading, they teach their students that the period means full stop. Stop reading for a moment. This is the end of a thought. Well, that's true. But it's not the only way to end a sentence. You can end a sentence with a comma. You can end a sentence with a semicolon. You can end a sentence with a parenthesis. You can end a sentence with a dash. But you are not ending the entire sentence. You're ending that grammatical sentence, that thought, whether it's an independent or a dependent clause is irrelevant. You're ending that part of it with that piece of punctuation. The three common pieces of punctuation are the formal end of sentence, the full stop, a period, an exclamation mark, exclamation point, or a question mark. Those three all signal the conclusion, the full stop of a sentence or question. But there are other ways that you can end a sentence without ending the entire sentence. A semicolon. What does a semicolon represent to the reader? A semicolon, in simple terms, means pause longer than a comma. But in grammatical terms, it means this is the end of this sentence. Now a related sentence is going to follow it, or related information is going to follow it. And you have examples there. We already talked a moment ago about the comma plus the coordinating conjunction, the comma plus words like and or but or yet or so, words that connect to that idea. Those are used in conjunction with the comma. Sometimes all you need is the comma. I left, but I returned. You need the comma plus the coordination there to join the ideas of leaving and returning. Sometimes you can use a period followed by a coordinating conjunction. The period, the full stop, this is the end of this sentence, but the coordinative conjunction, but, or and, or yet, therefore, is a coordinating conjunction. And when I was in school, we were taught rigorously, do not begin a sentence with a conjunction. You do not begin a sentence with and. You do not begin a sentence with but. Well, then why can I begin a sentence with therefore? I can't use and or but or so, but I can use yet or therefore. What we had was inconsistency in the grammatical world of the 1960s. Williams makes a good point about the period followed by the conjunction, the coordinating conjunction. Don't overuse it. It's all right to use it occasionally, but don't overuse it. In the same way, you can use a semicolon and a coordinating conjunction, but it's not grammatically wrong, but it's awkward for most readers and generally should be avoided. Why is it awkward? Well, simply put, a comma works just as well in most of those cases. The example he gives here, in the 1950s, religion came to be viewed as a bulwark against communism, semicolon, pause. So it was not long after that, atheism was felt to threaten national security. It would be simpler just to put a comma in there and move on. You can use a comma by itself, depending on how you join your grammatical sentences. You can use a conjunction alone. You don't always, this may be the single most common error that fledgling writers use or make, and that is to insert commas where they're not needed, to insert punctuation where it's not needed. When a conjunction is all you need, that's all you should use. I will say this, if you use Microsoft Word, or if you use Pages, you're a Mac person, use Pages. If you use any of the standard word processing programs, if you turn on the grammar checking function, most of them will highlight when you use a comma and a conjunction where it's not needed. They'll highlight that. And what that's telling you is get rid of the comma, you don't need it. Now, that being said, I have also found that most of those grammar checking functions don't seem to be able to recognize the Oxford comma, which is where you have a list of things, a series of things separated by commas, in which case the last one in the list is separated by a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Hammers, nails, screwdrivers, screws, and saws would be how you would end that list in your sentence. You would use that last coordinating conjunction to show this is the end of the list. But because you're using the Oxford comma, the repetitive comma, that gets a comma before the conjunction. Now, you have some other things here that Williams talks about, colons, dashes, and parentheses. The colon, the more formal, as it were, and that's how it's usually described. The more formal punctuation mark, it concludes a complete sentence, a complete thought, but it also introduces the idea, or should introduce the idea, that what follows relates to or illustrates or expands what was just said. Use colons carefully. They serve a very specific purpose. They join related ideas, related thoughts. Don't use them simply to break apart a long sentence. The dash, now in your word processor, you'll sometimes find the N dash and the M dash. One is a short dash, longer than a hyphen, but shorter than an M dash. An M dash is a longer dash. There is no grammatical distinction between them. Back in the bad old days of typewriters, you had a dash, period. And if you wanted to express the idea of a longer dash, you put two dashes, because there was no M dash character on typewriters. The dash is an informal colon in practical terms. A parenthesis, both parts. By the way, as you're reading aloud, you don't open parentheses, close parenthesis in your reading. You just read. However, with quotation marks, you might open quote and close quote. But parentheses indicate an afterthought. Parentheses indicate something that expands or explains, but is not essential to the basic thought that's there. Punctuation is not hard. And punctuation is not, it's not all about hard and fast rules. Now, Williams gives a lot more information in the appendix here, and it's very good. If you enjoy English grammar, read the rest of it. Do the exercises. You need not hand anything in about this. Just pay attention to punctuation. I'm going to give you back about 10 minutes tonight. Thank you for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next week.